Good afternoon and welcome to the Florida Bar Constitutional Judiciary Committee's webinar. Today we are going to take a look at the latest version of our presentation for benchmarks on the Florida Constitution Revision Commission. My name is Annette Pitts and I am joined today by the chair of the Florida Bar Constitutional Judiciary Committee, Judge Augustus Aikens.
Thank you, Annette. It's a pleasure to be with you. We have some really interesting subjects to discuss today about the Constitutional Revision Commission.
So we're going to have a lot of fun today. This is our third presentation on this. The first two, we looked at the more of the process and the people that were involved in this process. And today, now we know what's going to be on the ballot. And so we're going to provide additional information on that for lawyers and judges to utilize in their presentations. So here's what we want you to know, that we have a variety of benchmarks adult civic education programs that are on the Florida Bar website. The benchmarks program is actually a project of the Florida Bar Constitutional Judiciary Committee. And all of these presentations are designed for adult, nonpartisan audiences. Remember, if you are a member of the Florida Bar and you're presenting these, you're representing the Florida Bar. And so we just ask you to sort of follow the guidelines that we've established for the program, this program and any benchmarks program. Again, designed for use by attorneys and judges to educate the public about the courts and the Constitution. Each of these activities is going to range from about 30 to 45 minutes from start to finish. And we say they're sort of like a deck of cards that you can, make shorter or longer based on your needs. All of these presentations actually include warm-up activities. We call them icebreakers. When you go to the Florida Bar website, you'll see you can print out the handouts, the presentation guides. It's a step-by-step, really, review of what you need to present when you're doing a benchmarks presentation. And it really doesn't hurt to know that you also will receive CLE credit. So you're going to receive CLE credit, right, Judge, for attorneys who are actually listening to this webinar. We'll give them the CLE credit number at the end of the presentation. And
that's icing on the cake.
In
addition to the important information they're receiving, they get CLE credits.
That's right.
That's great.
It's really good. And so when you actually go out into the public and make a presentation using benchmarks, let's say you're going to do the Florida Constitutional Revision Commission presentation, you're going to also receive CLE ethics credit. So that's a real big plus as well.
And there's always a need for additional ethics credits.
Absolutely. So if you forget about this webinar, right, when they take it, they forget about it. How do I go back and find these materials from the bar's website? Here you go. Really, it's floridabar.org/benchmarks, and you'll find all of the presentations. This one is under special topics, but really important for you. If you forget everything we talk about today, you're going to be able to find all of the materials on the Florida Bar website. You'll also find, in addition to the specific presentation materials, you're going to find some materials in a toolkit that we offer you to give some foundational information about why you should do these presentations. It also is going to give you some suggestions for different groups that you can work with. And I think that's important. If this is your first time doing a benchmarks presentation, you'll also want to look at the tips for making good presentations, right? These were developed by people who have done a lot of these benchmarks presentations. And sometimes you can't really imagine some of the questions, right, that you'll get from an audience.
Well, and the person at the bar that you need to contact is Anna Lau, and the number is 850-561-5669.
Very good. So you have a staff person, you have all of these materials and a toolkit to help you, and the presentations are all up on the Florida Bar website, organized, as you can see, by content area and by name of the actual presentation. If you were to click on one of these, is it constitutional, then you'll be able to see all of the different materials that come up. And again, you'll have an overview, you'll have a PowerPoint, you'll have an icebreaker handout, And you'll have some background information for the presenter. So you'll have all the answers, right, that you need to make this presentation.
Everything that you need in one handy toolkit.
Absolutely. So let's focus on this third version of the Florida Constitution Revision Commission presentation. This is timely because these items will be on the ballot in November, right?
It will be November 6th.
And so it's really important that you go ahead and do these presentations between now and very early in November. So the presentation that we've designed for this period is really going to cover what is in the Florida Constitution, what should be in the Florida Constitution, how can the Constitution of Florida be amended, and how would you vote on proposals. That's just sort of an overview of this presentation, right? So the very first thing that you're going to do with this presentation, as people register and come in, and again, you could be in a library, you could be in a civic organization. I'm presenting this at a dinner meeting coming up for a civic group. And so lots and lots of variety in where you can make these presentations. Again, we are not suggesting in any way, shape, or form how people should vote on these ballot initiatives. Instead, we're educating them about the content, right?
And what's in the Constitution, and so they can make decisions on what should be in the Constitution.
Exactly. So this handout, when people arrive and they're registering for this presentation, this public presentation, you're going to give out this handout, and it's called, Is It in the Florida Constitution? We don't want them to use their phones and look up the answers, but we want them just to fill in this chart that we give them, and they're really just going to be trying to decide if they think this is in the Florida Constitution, right? And what kinds of things are on this this handout?
Well, we asked about residency qualifications for state legislatures. We also asked about whether or not there's certain legislation, certain matters in the Constitution, such as legalization of marijuana. We always asked about the pregnant pigs.
Of course. So we're really throwing some things out there to see if people know whether or not they are in the Constitution, so that we can talk about what should be in a Constitution, right?
Absolutely.
So it's a lot of fun. A lot of people don't know that in our state Constitution, there is a provision establishing English as the official language of Florida. That's the one that most people are most unfamiliar with. But this is just an awareness activity to get people thinking, and then we kind of review the answers before we go on. All right, so that's the first thing. Now, we want people to understand, really not to be embarrassed, right, if they don't know some of these things, because it's pretty common that the public's not aware of what's in our state constitution or our federal constitution, to be honest. So let's take a look at some of the statistics with respect to that. Annenberg Foundation found that only 26% of respondents could name all three branches of the U.S. government, and 31% could not name a single branch of government. And Judge, that is the most rudimentary kind of information we can know about our government, right?
It is. And many people hear about information that comes from the news and not assign it to any particular branch of government. So they don't know where it comes from. They hear occasionally about the Supreme Court, but they believe the Supreme Court is an arm of the executive branch, and they're confused by that.
Right. So we do need public education programs. So it's really, I think, very admirable that the Constitution and Judiciary Committee has taken this role on to educate the public. Some other interesting facts in terms of surveys: 1 in 5 Americans incorrectly thinks that a 5-4 Supreme Court decision is sent back to Congress for reconsideration. And then more recently, only 1 in 10 Florida residents could identify the Florida Constitution Revision Commission as one way to propose amendments to the Florida Constitution. So you don't think people are actually reading the state constitution at night before they go to bed, Judge?
In fact, most people really don't know that there is a constitution in the state of Florida.
So let's start there. What is a constitution, right? And we ask that to the audience. So when we start this presentation, you're going to be very interactive with the audience. You're going to walk around. You're not going to sit in front of a podium, stand at a podium and talk. You're going to really connect with your audience, talk to them in very conversational terms. And we're going to ask the audience, what is a constitution? Tell me the elements of a constitution. And then we're going to kind of highlight what they say. We're going to let them tell us, and then we're going to point out that it's very similar to a rule book for government, really. It outlines the structure and function of government, and it limits the powers of government, and it lists some of our rights. So it's really important that all of these things be highlighted, the powers of government, their rights, what's actually included in a constitution. So very, very important to just make sure the audience highlights these things, and if they don't, then we highlight them, right?
It's important for them to understand that our Constitution explains and defines the rights of the citizens. Once they become aware of that, they become more interested in learning about what's in the Constitution.
Right. That's a good point. So the next thing we do is compare constitutions. You know, a lot of people don't even know we have a state constitution, to be honest. So, but they are aware we have a federal constitution. So we put up here on the screen for the audience to look at some elements that are important for each of our state and federal constitution, and we compare some of those things. So how are they similar? They both set up the structure and function of government at the federal or state levels. Both limits the power of government at the federal or state level. Both have a listing of some of our rights. And so we would compare that. But what would we say about that, Judge?
Well, they're both very similar. One is a Bill of Rights that's in the U.S. Constitution. And in the Florida Constitution, we have what we call a Declaration of Rights, which set forth the rights of the people in the state of Florida.
So important to know where to look for those in a constitution. In the U.S. Constitution, they're in the back, right?
Exactly.
What about the Florida Constitution?
They're located within the Constitution itself.
Right.
And there's a Declaration of Rights provision in the Constitution.
We also look at how each of these documents can be amended and the fact that they're the highest law. Okay. Really, really important. This is the definition that we show the audience on the Florida Constitution. This is from the Florida Legislature website, and it defines the Florida Constitution as an organized system of fundamental principles for the government of the state. And some really important words that we emphasize are that it's of a more permanent and general nature, and it originates from the people as opposed to from the legislature.
Exactly.
And that's important.
It's very important.
So we really want to emphasize those. And then a lot of these slides are animated and try to emphasize certain components. Then we have the public look at sort of a table of contents, right? This is, if this was a book, the Florida Constitution, this would be our table of contents. And we have them pick out things that are similar. So what would be similar from our state constitution to our federal constitution? What does the public usually pick out there?
Well, it's set forth in articles that defines what in both the federal constitution as well as the state constitution. We mentioned earlier on the Declaration of Rights. That's at the very beginning on Article 1 of the Florida Constitution. It sets forth the rights of the citizens of the state of Florida. Also, it breaks out the different branches of government in clear terms of the different articles in the Florida Constitution. It tells how the Constitution can be amended in the state of Florida. And it also covers suffrage and elections in clear terms in the state of Florida.
It's kind of nice to be able to point out the similarities and the differences. And, we really try to pull out in the Florida Constitution as well that they'll see a section on education. Right? And that's not in the federal Constitution.
Not in the federal Constitution.
another really important thing that we do in preparing to teach about the Constitution Revision Commission is to help the public understand the difference between a constitution and a statute, right?
Exactly.
So if we were climbing a ladder, right, and the very lowest rung of that ladder was, let's say it's the ladder of law, right? We would start with ordinances or local government laws, and then we would step up. What would be above that, Judge?
Well, it would be the statutes that were promulgated by the state legislature. Then, of course, at the very top, when you find our Constitution.
Right. So we want people to understand sort of that hierarchy of law and the differences between what should be in a statute versus a constitution. And that discussion takes a little time, doesn't it? What kind of things would you point out to the audience in terms of the differences between a constitution and a statute?
Well, one of the things you would point out with the Constitution that it's intended to be permanent. It's broad in terms of its scope. A statute may be more detailed in nature because it defines exactly the intent of the legislature. So there would be differences like that.
It's going to be a little more difficult to change a constitution, right, than it is a statute, because a statute may change every year, right?
As the circumstances change, then the legislature modifies that statute so that it's more current with what's the expectation and perhaps sometimes the risks that are confronting the citizens of the state of Florida.
So a little more difficult, maybe a little more time consuming to make a change to a constitution, and that's by design, right?
It's intended to be that way. It's broad and gives great directions to the people, so you don't want to confuse them. You want to give them what those established rights are so they know how to operate.
So then we're going to focus, after we've talked a little bit about the differences between a constitution and a statute, what is in a constitution, what it looks like, then we're going to move into the Florida Constitution directly. So, it's a good transition to begin to talk about how often should we change a constitution, okay? So let's look at the United States Constitution, for example. Only been 27 amendments, right?
Oh, yes.
Though more than 11,000 proposed amendments. That's a lot, right? So why? That's such a shocking statistic for people, isn't it? To show that 11,000 proposals and only 27 ratified. So what does that tell you?
Well, there's a resistance in terms of changing the Constitution because it's designed to be permanent in scope. And what the framers intended is that the Constitution not be frequently changed. The rights that are set forth in the Constitution should be well known to the people and depended upon as the basis upon which this country operates. So there's a lot of resistance in changing those. The political winds change constantly, but the rights of the people will be permanent.
Good. So let's compare that with the Florida Constitution then. We've had more than 120 amendments since 1968. And a little different, you can go to the United States Constitution, turn to the back and see the 27 amendments, right? Mm-hmm. But when the Florida Constitution is amended, how is that different?
It amends the articles within the Constitution itself. So when you look at the Florida Constitution, you don't see those amendments separated distinctly. They are intertwined with the language of the Constitution. And so you won't be able to go in and see those changes. Which is different from the U.S. Constitution, where you see those amendments listed separately within the document.
And that number, 120, even though it looks like a lot more, historically than the U.S. Constitution, it's actually a pretty average number for a state constitution to be amended. So how do we amend the Florida Constitution? There are 5 ways, and we just addressed this very matter of fact with the public. We just list the 5 ways, so we can go ahead and pull those up on the screen. The first is proposal by the legislature. It used to be the only way you could amend our state constitution, right? And you can refer to that sometimes as a joint resolution. That's how you may see it in the media, the paper. The one we're going to focus on today is this revision commission, right?
Right.
Constitution Revision Commission. That happens every 20 years. So, it's not going to happen every year. So it's a very special process. So this one is the one we'll focus on today.
Exactly. And it's a unique process because it can come from different sources. It can come from the people throughout the state of Florida. They may come up with suggestions and changes. It may come from interest groups or legislators as to we are modifying the Constitution. But there's a lot of public discussion before these proposals are finalized.
And we hope that people read them before they vote for them. So we're going to take a look again, 5 different ways to amend our Constitution, from the legislature to the Revision Commission to citizen initiatives. And we're going to focus on the Constitution Revision Commission today. That's our primary objective. So let's see what this Revision Commission actually does. They meet every 20 years, and they're appointed to adopt their own rules of procedure. They're going to examine the Constitution, the whole document, right?
Exactly. They go through and scrub the Constitution. They divide themselves by sections and look at the Constitution through a microscope to see what needs to be amended. And they come up with proposals for discussion. So
this commission actually looks at the document. They hold these public hearings, right? So the public gets to have input as a part of that process. And then they're going to file recommended changes to the Constitution, if any, right? And they'll be on the ballot for the next general election. Doesn't mean if the commission recommends, right, that it gets in the Constitution, because ultimately, who decides if it goes in the Constitution?
The voters in the state of Florida will decide if it goes in the Constitution or not.
But this commission is really important, isn't it? Because they are responsible for implementing this process, and they will be listening to the public, but ultimately they will decide which proposals will make it on the ballot. So that's an incredibly important role for these 37 people, right, that serve on this commission. So how do they get there? I love this little visual because this is written in the Constitution. So how could this be changed, Judge?
By amendment of the Constitution.
By amendment of the Constitution. So 37 people, according to our state constitution, comprise the Florida Constitution Revision Commission. And these are the methods of appointment. So 15 members are appointed directly by the governor.
Exactly.
9 are appointed by the Speaker of the House. 9 are appointed by the President of the Senate. And 3 by the Chief Justice of the Florida Supreme Court. And one person, one office is always on this commission automatically, and that's the Attorney General.
Exactly.
Of Florida. Our commission this time, the 37 appointments, you can see a broad range of professionals and professions represented, and this is a photo of them. And so, again, you can look at this year's appointees and go back and look at the numbers appointed by each of the branches. So again, I think it's so important to keep emphasizing, no matter what those 37 people recommended, right? These proposals do not go in the Constitution unless the voters decide that the proposal will be added. So it's kind of funny when people learn that we have a provision for pregnant pigs, for instance. People laugh about that. And then you say, well, how did it get in there?
Because the voters decided it should be in there.
That's right. So the voters voted for it. And it takes 60% of voters to approve that proposal before it gets into the Constitution. But these are enormous, sometimes changes to this document. sometimes very subtle changes. And sometimes you may think, should it be in our Constitution at all, right?
Exactly. And on the 60%, it's interesting that at one time it was 50%.
Right.
And in 2006, it was amended to require 60% approval before these changes are implemented.
So remember, the ultimate role is the role of the voter to decide whether or not these proposals that have been recommended for change are actually included in the state constitution. So in previous presentations, we really focused on the process of this body. Now we're through, right? We're through with that process. So we're going to focus more on the content of the proposals.
Right. The commission is filed with the Secretary of State its proposals for inclusion on the ballot this November.
Listen, there were lots of things thrown out there, right? There were like 900 public and commissioner-sponsored ideas and proposals. People could file them online. People could go to these hearings and propose them. People could write in. You know, it was all these different ways that they could. So that's a lot of proposals, right?
There's a lot of proposals. In fact, they advanced 25 of those 900 or so proposals for the consideration to the Style and Drafting Committee.
That's a big jump, though, right? From 900 to 25. That's they had to do a lot of cutting, right?
A lot of cutting.
A lot of cutting and pasting. So we went down to 25, and they went to this committee, right, called Style and Drafting. And the responsibilities of that committee, as a part of the commission, was to draft the language for these proposals that would appear on the ballot. That's really important. Why is that so important?
Because it would give the voters an understanding of what's included in these proposals. So the words matter. And that's really important, how they describe what these revisions would entail and how it would affect the voters if we approve these changes.
So this committee, again, is going to draft, or they have already drafted the language for the proposals. They also drafted the grouping and the ordering of the proposals. So, we went from 900 to 25. Can you imagine 25 proposals on the ballot that you had to vote on? So this committee looked to see if there were some similarities, some ways to group things. And then the commission had to review and vote on those once they saw that proposal. But what you said is really important, that words matter, right?
It's exactly right. It really matters.
How are these proposals actually written up in a way that the voters can understand the full measure that's on the ballot and the impact too, right? Because that's important, very, very important. So starting now from 900, we're at 25. And those 25 proposals that were submitted to Style and Drafting were returned as 12 revisions, okay? So that in itself is a point to stop and have a conversation. Do you think that proposals should be grouped together on a ballot, right? Let the public tell us their thoughts on that. And what could be the impact of grouping proposals?
And that should generate a lot of conversation among the people attending, because I'm sure there's some thought that they would prefer not to have them grouped so they can make independent decisions in each of the subject matters that may be joined together in one proposal.
And think about it. Let's say there are 3 proposals in one ballot summary. And so maybe you agree with one, but you don't agree with the other 2. Then you really have to give some thought as to what you're going to do, right?
Exactly.
So this is a point of discussion here where you would interact with the public and let them tell you their thoughts on the purpose of grouping, what are the pros and cons, right? And what is the impact of grouping those proposals. So the final 8. So all of those proposals had to get 22 commissioner votes to be placed on the general election ballot.
And 22 is important because that's is 37 members of the Constitution Revision Commission, and meeting 22 it's a substantial number of them. It's more than 50% of the members of the commission.
So 8 of the 12 proposed revisions were approved by the full commission. And some of those are grouped together and some are standalone. So we're going to take a look at that, and we are going to tell you what we do with the public in talking about those. So we're going to take a look at those next. This next visual really shows you everything that's going to be on the ballot. When we did this, and this is updated even from the one that's on the bar's website right now, because now we know the ballot number, okay? Initially, we knew the proposal number from the commission. Now we know the number, which means the order in which they will appear on the ballot. That's important, isn't it?
It is.
Because these are not the only ones on the ballot, right? These are not the only amendments proposed to the Florida Constitution on the ballot. These are just the ones that were recommended by the Florida Constitution Revision Commission.
And there's always the fear that the voters may suffer fatigue when they get toward the end of the ballot, since these proposals generally are at the end of the ballot.
Right. So you can see the pros and cons, right? People will say, listen, I want each one of these to individually appear on the ballot so I can vote on each one, not be grouped so that I have to make a decision if I like one and don't like another. But then you say, listen, if we put all of these out on the ballot, plus the others from the legislature and from citizen initiatives, we may have a ballot that just goes on and on and on.
Exactly.
And people may not vote at all, right? So these are the ones from the Constitution Revision Commission. And the ballot numbers, you'll see they appear as 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, and 13. So these are the ones. Why is it important for people to know, in terms of proposals, which ones were introduced by which method? Why is that important, do you think?
Well, it may give the members of the public an idea if there's some special interest that's pushing a proposal or certain particular groups that may be interested in it. It may give them just some understanding of the proposal itself.
I agree. I think it's really important. So let's take a look. On the ballot, number 6 will be the rights of crime victims along with judges. We're going to take a look at each of these in just a second. The next one that will appear as on the ballot is number 7. Will deal with first responders and military member survivor benefits. And what is that grouped with?
Public colleges and universities.
So here we're grouping 3 proposals together that you'll need to vote on. And when you vote yes or no for those, right? If you vote yes, you get all 3 as a package, right?
Exactly.
Number 8, what is that one going to look at?
It's going to look at school boards' term limits and duties, and also public schools, and how you define what is the body that has authority to make determinations about those public schools within the school district.
So you can see on this slide that ballot number 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and 11 are the grouped proposals.
Yes.
Right? And then the other 2, 12 and 13, are individual items, right? So why is that important for the public to recognize the differences between those?
Well, it's important that the Constitution Revision Commission thought that they should not be grouped with anything else, and they should be standalone proposals. And that's an indication itself that perhaps there's nothing else that substantially impacts those areas that was proposed by the Constitution Revision Commission.
So this is a snapshot, really, of what you're going to show the public as to the items that will be on the ballot by the Constitution Revision Commission. Again, emphasizing that there will be other proposals on the ballot from other methods of amending the Constitution.
Exactly.
What we're going to do next with the public as a part of this presentation is to talk to them briefly about these topics. We're going to ask them to consider, as they go through these, how are the proposals grouped together and the ones that they're going to look at? Then we're going to ask them if they agree with how the proposals are grouped together. I have to tell you, the last training I did, someone said to me, is there any logic, right, to how these were put together? And so I would say, if you were to go back and look at these, you could see some of these connections, let's say. So take a look at number 8, proposal 6003.
Right.
What's the common ground there?
So you're dealing with schools.
Right. You're dealing with schools, education. So those kinds of things are the, I guess, the logic to the framework in terms of the groupings. Those are the kinds of things that the commission considered, right, in putting them together. So do you agree with how the proposals are grouped together? That's a good question. When people start to sort through the content, even if it's logical that we're going to deal with education, are these so different in the realm of education that you can make a decision and be happy, right?
That should generate a lot of discussion.
It does.
Because you can look at these different proposals, although there may be some relationship between the two, such as the school districts and schools. Many people feel that they should have an opportunity to separately indicate their preference for them.
Right. Yeah. Because if they feel strongly about one item, but not about the others, and they decide to vote against it because they don't really feel strongly about the other two, then yeah, I mean, it's a really difficult decision. So we put people through this in advance of doing it at the ballot box, right? Because, I mean, these are lengthy proposals in some cases. You really need to be able to have read through them and understand them.
Isn't it a matter of compromise? And sometimes you have to make a decision whether or not you want to accept one portion, even though you may not be in favor of another. That's part of the entire legislative process. All bills that come from the legislature, they have everything in it that you like. There's some things in it that you would not prefer, but it's part of the compromise.
When I've done this with the public, oftentimes they'll say, are there other remedies? Let's say if I vote no on these proposals, the first question you may ask yourself is, should this be in the Constitution, right? Is there another avenue for some of these proposals if they don't make it into the Constitution?
Well, there are those 5 methods of amending our Constitution. You can return to one of the other processes, such as perhaps a legislative resolution that comes from the legislature. Or it could be one of the other methods, citizen initiative, for example.
So it depends on how strongly you feel about one. And I think, too, some of the topics, people may say, well, what you've learned about statutes, maybe they could be a statute as opposed to a constitution, right? So there are other avenues, I guess, remedies. Other things we want the public to think about as they look at these proposals, again, is it already addressed in state statutes? And this is important, isn't it? How about, was this amendment previously proposed and failed, right? You can look for this information on the Division of Elections website. And who might support this proposal, all 3 groupings of things together, and who might oppose it? And does this proposal ultimately belong in the Florida Constitution? I want to emphasize that over and over, right?
I was going to say that's perhaps the most important one. Whether this proposal belong in the Constitution in the first place.
Right. And I think that's what this presentation tries to get people to think critically about. It doesn't matter, how they vote, but we want them to vote in an educated way and to think about the content of the proposals. Is it something that should be in a Florida Constitution? All right. Then we have the exercise, right? And again, depending on the time that you have for your presentation, we're going to put people in small groups. And the handouts that we have as a part of this are the actual proposals, right? And you can give one group one proposal, another group another proposal. And the handouts that we provide to them they will analyze their assigned proposals. Now, we've done this before together, right? So talk about that a little bit.
Well, it was an interesting exercise. We did it with the in-court meeting here in Tallahassee. It was great discussions on those proposals. People got a chance to look at the proposal language itself and what's intended as part of the amendment, and how long, how important it is to put this amendment in the Constitution. So great discussion originated from that.
So the interesting thing to me is this, the difference between how people answered with response to a proposal when you ask the question, should it be in the Florida Constitution? So you look at the proposal from that perspective. And then from the other perspective is, how would you vote on that proposal, right?
Exactly.
And sometimes there's a disconnect there because people feel so passionately about a particular proposal, right? I mean, all you have to do is go back and look at some of the visuals, some of the hearings, the public hearings, when people spoke in support of the Greyhound proposal and things like that. You can see the passion that comes out.
Absolutely. And those are the kinds of things that really generate a lot of discussion among the audience during these presentations. One of the things that they're concerned about, if it says a revision of a provision of the statute of the Constitution, then there's language already there. Does it improve it, make it better, or does it make it worse?
Good point. Really good point. All right, so we're going to just put up on the screen. This is a part of your presentation. This is the PowerPoint you would use in your presentation, right? And again, you've been interacting with the public. You've been talking and having a conversation with them. You're developing relationships. And then you're going to have this breakout session where each small group, and ideally they'll already be seated at round tables and small groups. You won't have to put people in groups. That's ideal. You're going to give them one of these proposals. Your choice, right? If you want to address all the proposals or you just want to focus on a couple, right?
Exactly.
Just to show them the process. So again, we were going to give them as handouts these proposals, and you will give one proposal to each group, and they'll have a handout to evaluate that proposal,
exactly.
Right? So we'll give them the one that combines rights of crime victims with judges. So what's the deal with the judges? What's this proposal proposing for judges?
It revises an existing provision in the Constitution, which limits the age upon which judges continue to serve until age 70. It raises it to age 75. Okay.
So if they vote for the rights of crime victims, again, the titles don't say a lot, do they? You really have to read the meat of each proposal, and that's why we want to give the public an opportunity to do that, right?
Yeah. And this one should raise a lot of discussion because victim rights is already in the Constitution, but this is an attempt, already in the statute. This is an attempt to put this as part of the Constitution to define more clearly what the rights of victims are.
Interesting.
And give the victims certain guaranteed constitutional rights and make that a part of the Constitution.
So I get that question all the time. If it's already in statute, Judge, why do we need it in the Constitution?
One of the things is the argument is that those rights are not fully being protected by being in statute. They want to make sure that these rights are permanent, firm, and also there's some additional language added that they should be given certain advice constitutionally.
Yeah. Okay. Then the one we talked about really is the education one, school board term limits and duties, and focus on public schools. The next one deals with an interesting combination here. You want to talk about this one just a little bit?
Yeah. Prohibit offshore oil and gas drilling. One part of it, the other part deals with vaping in enclosed indoor workplaces. And of course, vaping deals with these devices generated vapors instead of smoking. And it limits their ability to use that within the public places. Of course, it allows them to do so in places where smoking is permitted.
Okay. Here we go. This is our Greyhound one, right? And again, yes. In this activity that you're doing with the public, they're going to read the exact language of the proposal right. as it would be on the ballot, right? Again, very, very important. Those are just a few. Very, very important to look at the fact that the Constitution Revision Commission proposals are not the only amendment proposals on the ballot. There will be other proposals from the legislature and citizen initiatives mm-hmm. that will be on the ballot for the public to vote on as well, right?
That's exactly right. And you got 8 from the Constitution Revision Commission, 3 from the Florida legislature, and 2 from vote initiative.
So really, really important. And in this presentation, we don't spend a lot of time on those other additional proposals. They're not a part of the breakout session, but we do highlight them, excuse me, because we want the public to understand. These are the ones from the legislature. So there are 3, and we do highlight those as well as the citizen initiatives. And the big one probably that we've heard a lot of people talking about is the one on the voting restoration amendment.
Right.
I always tell people to get more information on these, right? You can go to the Florida Division for Elections website and pull up any of these. It's an interactive website so that you can click on the proposal and read it. But the other thing that's really interesting that we talked about in a lot of our trainings is that when the public, if you don't have a lot of information, if you just see a title and a summary, right, you might want to go in, especially on the citizen initiatives, because you think, okay, who is proposing this, right? A group of citizens that really care about something. But you can go on this website and find out who those people are, right, that are proposing this, if there are groups involved, what the cost, what kind of cost is associated with this, and where did the money come from?
Exactly.
That's really, really important.
During our exercise earlier, Annette, it's interesting when we first discussed some of these proposals, a lot of people were against them until they actually read the language.
Right.
And once they read the language, they had a different opinion about it. Mm-hmm. And until you read the language, you really don't know whether or not this is something that really should be in the Constitution, whether or not it's really will be helpful to the people of the state of Florida. So it's necessary to understand these people.
It's ultimately up to the voter, right? Mm-hmm. And again, this presentation is not about helping people, to decide one way or the other. It's really about helping them analyze and evaluate the language of the proposals and determining if they think it should be a part of the Constitution, and ultimately how they would vote on it.
That's exactly right.
Okay, so again, we look at should it be in the Constitution, and then we let them vote on this. We do not release their votes publicly, of course, but we collect their votes, and then we see which proposals would actually pass if this was the voting populace for that amendment, right? So that's a lot of fun.
It's a lot of fun, and people enjoy it because it's, they get to see it through lenses other than which they've seen before.
That's right. They learn a lot by doing this presentation. I say that I learn a lot, too, from the public. And ultimately, again, I emphasize that the voters decide what will go in the Constitution. Great websites. Florida Bar has done a great job of providing a lot of public information as well. You can go to the FCRC website to look at some of the proposals that didn't make it as well. And the Florida Bar's Protect Florida Democracy program has some beautiful handouts. It has a video and other materials that you could look at as members of the bar and utilize in your presentations, right? I love ending with this quote: "If men were angels, no government would be necessary." I guess we need government, don't we?
We need government.
We need government. And so we hope that members of the bar will utilize this presentation and go out to civic organizations, make these presentations in a very nonpartisan way. For the webinar today, you do receive an hour of general CLE credit. The number is on the screen, 1-800-492-6N. And the course title is Benchmarks Examining the Issues. We hope that you've learned a lot today, right? It'll still take some time. They still need to review the proposals and be able to answer questions from the public if they have them. But I hope you'll go out and do these presentations with the public. Again, time sensitive, right, Judge?
It's absolutely time sensitive. November is the absolute deadline.
Absolute deadline. So, Judge Aikens, I want to thank you again as chair of the Constitutional Judiciary Committee. We appreciate so much your leadership and your work with that committee and educating the public.
It's been enjoyable. Thank you.
Thank you.